do something a little off the beaten path here, and I wanted to do a short little intro to international politics video. Ooh, very controversial, very controversial. As you can see there, Professor Daft Raincloud. If you guys did not know, I've mentioned it a couple times, but one of my areas of study is political science. And within the political science realm, my focus areas were international politics and political psychology. So I thought, why not make a informative sort of ASMR video? Maybe you can learn a little bit as you relax, and I could talk about something that I am passionate about. This is just gonna be like a week one of international politics 101 sort of thing, so we aren't going to go super in depth on anything. We're just going to be skimming the surface here. If you find this interesting and would like to know more, I'd recommend you dig around, do your own research, maybe look up some of the authors, philosophers, etc. that I mentioned in this video, and just explore on your own time. But let's go to the first page, and the first thing that I think we need to talk about here is sovereignty. Sovereignty. It's a term that I'm sure we've all heard, but do we really know what it means? You see, I have a little quote up there, and it says that a state is either sovereign or it is not a state. And that is a quote from D.A. Lake. But we have a definition here from a German philosopher, I suppose, a German scholar named Max Weber. And Weber defines sovereignty as a monopoly on legitimate use of force within a given territory. So, for example, most of my viewers live in the United States. We in the United States understand that the United States government has a monopoly on use of force within the United States. The Canadian military isn't coming into the United States and enforcing laws. There aren't guerrilla groups patrolling the street enforcing their own set of laws. There aren't breakaway parts of the country that have their own laws and enforcement of those laws. The United States government and the police forces, etc., that are contracted and work under it are the only entities allowed to use force within the borders of the United States. And we understand that, and we don't question that. We don't question the fact that maybe there's another force or another group that should be using force in the United States. Now, the term legitimate, a legitimate use of force, that means that basically we understand why the force is being used. Basically, we don't believe that the government is just wantonly destroying things, hurting people for no reason. And bottom right corner, that is a picture of Max Weber. He lived from 1864 to 1920. And the main type of sovereignty when most people just say the word sovereignty, they are mostly speaking about Westphalian sovereignty, which is also referred to as state sovereignty. And Westphalian sovereignty is the principle that each state has exclusive sovereignty. And the term comes from the Peace of Westphalia, which happened in 1648 at the end of the 30 Years' War. So to continue on with Westphalian sovereignty, Joseph Jaffe, he defines it as an exclusion of external actors from domestic authority structures, which is the principle of non-intervention. So an exclusion of external actors from domestic authority structures. So basically, like what I was saying before, the United States is not having Canada enforce the law and hold control of some part of the country. And if, let's say for instance, I don't know, just let's say an insane thing, maybe Russia went over and claimed part of Alaska, well then you would say that the Westphalian sovereignty of the United States was being encroached upon, basically, by Russia. Because an external actor would then be in our domestic authority structures, and there would be intervention in our authority structures. Westphalian sovereignty also states that states have an innate right to self-defense. To protect the state, protect their sovereignty. And, just as an aside, when I'm saying the word states throughout this, I mean it as nations or countries, not, like the United States, like Florida or Texas or something. Jaffe also states that war is only acceptable if it is just, and this is referred to as the just war doctrine, basically saying that you can't just go to war for whatever reason. You have to have a justifiable reason, which would be self-defense for the most part. That's pretty much the only reason under just war doctrine to go to war is self-defense. If a state attacks you, you have the right to defend yourself and attack them back. But unless that happens, there should be a principle of non-intervention. It's Westphalian sovereignty. And now we get into one of the two leading theories, or I guess kind of pillars of international politics and international relations theory, and that is realism. And realism states that the world is a place of anarchy. And when I'm saying anarchy, it's not talking about, listening to punk music and wearing vests with spikes and studs on them. No. When realists talk about anarchy, they mean that there are no rules or laws that govern state interactions with one another. There are only rules and laws within the borders of states. Again, using the United States as an example, we have a set of laws that we understand that we all have to follow, or you will get arrested. You can't kill people, you can't steal things, you can't do certain drugs. You understand these laws, but there are no laws on the international level. Not really, because there is no international police force. All these countries can sit around and say, oh, we won't do this, we won't do that. But at the end of the day, if they do decide to do that, who is going to stop them? So that is what realists mean. The world is anarchic because there are no laws or rules that dictate how two countries deal with one another. Realists also say that states are self-interested. The only consideration should be for the advancement of the state. The only consideration. If you want to do something and you can be pretty sure, you can be assured that by doing it, you will improve your country, whether it's you'll get more natural resources, you'll get more land, you'll get something to improve your quality within your country, you should do it if you can, because the only consideration is for the advancement of your state. Realists say also that states should assume that all other states are self-interested and they will take what they can for themselves. So you're basically living in a constant state of paranoia. You know you and your state want to do as much as you can to make yourself better, but your neighbor also wants to do the same, and that might eventually bring them knocking on your front door. Therefore, power is the only meaningful currency. Money, diplomacy, bargaining does not matter. The only thing that matters is power, and specifically military power. Now we have Thucydides in the Melian dialogue. Thucydides was an old ancient times philosopher. You see a statue of him in the bottom right there. We are not 100% sure when he lived, but kind of the thrown around date is that he lived from 460 to 404 BC. And Thucydides kind of lays the groundwork for realism. So this is a principle that is thousands of years old. It is born out of the barbarity of the ancient world, and people are still talking about it today with regards to modern politics and relations. So the Melian dialogue, Melos is a little island in the Aegean Sea. You can see it, that picture at the very top. You see Athens and Sparta in orange and green respectively, and then you see Melos there in purple. And Melos was this little commerce island, and they had a port. And there was a port there, and both the Spartans and the Athenians wanted Melos to join them. But the Athenians got there first, and they encircled Melos with their military. Hundreds, if not thousands, of Athenian soldiers surrounded the city, and they were basically telling the Melians to surrender and become part of Athens. And if they chose not to surrender, the Athenians said that they would kill every single person in Melos. And here is the quote from the Athenian general that Thucydides wrote down as he was documenting the war. As you can see, that picture of the man addressing the crowd, that's an artistic representation of what happened, but this is a historical account written by Thucydides, the Athenian general. Goes to the Melians and he says, "You know as well as we do that when these matters are discussed by practical people, the standard of justice depends on the equality of power to compel. And in fact, the strong do what they have the power to do, and the weak accept what they have to accept." And this paragraph, this statement here, is the crux, the backbone of realism. The strong do what they have the power basically saying your justice is not our justice because you do not have the power to force us to do anything you want us to do. And the Athenians are basically saying, look, we will absolutely crush you if you force us to, but give up your independence, become a part of Athens, accept that because you are weaker than us, and you can live, and you'll be a part of something bigger and better. And the Melians resisted. They chose not to surrender to the Athenians, and they were all killed. They were just absolutely slaughtered by the Athenians. Hundreds dead. And the Athenians took Melos. Because, again, they were the strong. The Melians were the weak. Therefore, they did what they had the power to do, which was to kill all of them. And that is like I said, just to reiterate, the backbone of realism. Okay. Moving on. We have Thomas Hobbes. There's a picture of him in the bottom right. He lived from 1588 to 1679. And he was a British monarchist. He was a big fan of the crown. And he wrote this book in 1651 called Leviathan. And Leviathan was in reference to the British crown, the monarch. Also a biblical reference to the biblical Leviathan, but in the case of the book, it was in reference to the crown. And Hobbes says the power of the sovereign, and in this case the sovereign is the crown, the power of the sovereign is justified by the consent of the governed, who agreed in social hypothetical contract to obey the sovereign in exchange for peace and security. So Hobbes is basically saying, look, these people, by right of being born here, living here, they've signed this hypothetical contract, and they're basically telling the crown, as long as you can keep us peaceful and secure, we will obey by your laws. So keep war away from our homes. Keep food on the table, keep the money flowing, keep the state in healthy order, and we'll listen to what you want us to do. But it's a two-way street. If the sovereign does not provide peace and security, then the consent of the governed can be withdrawn. Now, obviously, he's talking about the British crown here, but you could also apply this to any sovereign, the United States government, the Canadian government, the Chinese government, etc., etc. Hobbes also says that there are three causes of violence, and that is competition, diffidence, and glory. So he says you can look at all these different wars, conflicts, and you can try and analyze it and look at historical context and try to really get to the heart of the issue and figure out what happened. But at the end of the day, the only actual reason why there was a conflict was either competition, diffidence, or glory. Take a quick sip of my beverage here. Okay. More from Thomas Hobbes. In Leviathan, he says that without the sovereign, life is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. He also says that without the sovereign, there is no place for industry, there is no commerce, there is no society, and there is no justice. So Hobbes is basically saying that without some form of structure, government, monarchy, whatever, life basically has no meaning. And it's just going to be a bunch of people running around, grunting at each other and bashing each other's heads in. Now we get to Hans Morgenthau, a little bit more contemporary. There he is in the bottom right. German man. He lived from 1904 to 1980. And in 1948, Hans Morgenthau wrote this book called Politics Among Nations. And he stated that there are 6 principles of political realism, and this is with regards to states dealing with other states. He said that laws must be rooted in human nature, so basically you can't try and force people to go against human nature, because that's not going to work. Interest must be defined in terms of power. Also, interest in power is universal. Every single state, regardless of size or ability, wants power. So if you have the power, if you currently have the power, you need to hold on to it and not assume that other people are just okay with you keeping it and won't try to take it from you. Everybody wants power. He states that prudence is the supreme virtue. Individual morality is not universal morality. So, let's say you're a Christian. You believe, be nice to your neighbors, don't have an affair, don't steal money, don't hurt people, whatever. Just because that is your morality does not mean that is the morality of somebody in another state. So you cannot operate under the assumption that anybody you're dealing with has the same morals as you. Morgenthau also stated that there needs to be an autonomy of the political sphere. Basically, the politician should not be worried about the economist. The economist should not be worried about the lawyer. The lawyer should not be worried about the general, etc. The politician must do what the politician needs to do without worry or care of the economy, the law, anything else. Basically what he's saying there. And then we get to neorealism. I'm just going to touch on this for a second because this is a very deep rabbit hole I could go down, but neorealists, also referred to as structural realism, they take the idea of realism and kind of modernize it a little bit to account for the way things currently are in the 21st century. They say, okay, yeah, the world is still anarchic, but the anarchy can be contained through an international system of cooperation which provides structure. So, as long as there are structures, which is where the structural realism comes from, you can contain the anarchy. But they also state that there's a distribution of power in the international system. So instead of it being a single self-interested state, there's maybe a collection of states or an institution that has power. You could say, for instance, that NATO or the EU has a lot of power distributed to them based on who the members are. So even though there's peace theoretically, not every country is equal. There's still, the United States, China, Russia. And the distribution of power is not equal in the international system. Some have more than others. Okay, now we move on to the response to realism, which is liberalism. And we say liberalism, we're not referring to, like the Democratic Party or anything. A lot of people will say little l liberalism or small l liberalism when talking about this. And that in the bottom right is Immanuel Kant, who is kind of one of the big thinkers behind liberalism. He lived from 1724 to 1804. Liberals, they accept that the world is anarchic, they look at the realists and they're like, you're right, the world is anarchic, but we can fix it. And there's a system, it's sometimes referred to as the Kantian tripod, and this is the three branches of liberalism. And that is Republican liberalism, which refers to representative democracy; institutional liberalism, which is an adherence to international laws and institutions; and commercial liberalism, which is an integration of economies. And those three things, the Kantian tripod, the three legs, make up liberalism. Republican liberalism. They noticed a trend that democracies do not tend to go to war with one another. And for the most part, this is true. It is extremely rare for actual democracies with free and fair elections to go to war with other liberal democracies with free and fair elections. Now, obviously, there are some flawed democracies, authoritarian democracies. You can look at Russia, Hungary, places like that. But those would not be considered a true Republican democracy, representative democracy. Liberal republics introduce unique norms and institutional constraints which lead to peace. So liberal democracies are more likely to behave in certain predictable ways which lead to peace. Also, in a liberal democracy, a leader who sends its nation into an unpopular, unjust, costly war will be voted out of office. They'll be removed from power. And so they have to consider any actions they take, which therefore leads to peace. Because they know that if they don't maintain peace and security, that the constraints of the institutions of the democratic system will get rid of them. Domestic institutions introduce steep hurdles to overcome, but they can be overcome. And this is sort of talking about, the War Powers Act, the ability for the president to act unilaterally and conduct war, specifically with regards to the United States, but other countries as well. So there are constraints, but they are not absolute. To continue with Republican liberalism, I have this quote here from Winston Churchill. This is sort of a critique of liberalism. And Churchill states, "Democracy is more vindictive than cabinets. The wars of people will be more terrible than those of kings." Sort of a controversial statement there, but basically saying that for the most part people will want peace, but when the popular sentiment turns to war and violence, that war and violence will be absolutely brutal, gruesome, destructive. Republican liberalism, the path to peace is via the expansion of democracy. So the only way we'll ever truly achieve peace is if the entire world is a liberal democracy. Power is used to expand democracy. This is sort of the idea of peace at the point of a spear, or peace at the end of the barrel of a gun. Basically, we know democracies do not go to war. This country is not a democracy. Therefore, we should go to war with them, overthrow their government, install a liberal democracy. Therefore, power is the path to peace. Peace via military intervention. Sort of a double-edged sword, you can say, but it does sort of make sense in a way. If the ends justify the means. Institutional liberalism. This is basically stating that democracies have shared norms which strengthen bonds and interactions. So, the United States, Canada, Germany, France. These are all liberal democracies, and they all have shared norms and values because of that fact, and that allows us to cooperate with one another. Institutions enforce norms and behavior inside liberal democratic states. So, people within liberal democracies, regardless of where it is in the world, all tend to act the same. A United States citizen will act very similarly to a Canadian citizen, or a French citizen, or a German citizen, or a Mexican citizen, because they act similarly due to the fact they both live in liberal democracies. And examples of these institutions would be NATO, the European Union, World Bank, and the IMF. And then I have a nice little NATO flag there in the bottom right. And then we have commercial liberalism. Commercial liberalism is the economic interdependence raises the cost of war. So, if the United States is trading with, Egypt. Let's say the United States has these trade deals with Egypt. They're sending stuff back and forth to each other. If one of us decides to go to war with the other, all of a sudden that trade is cut off, and maybe Egypt has natural resources that the United States does not have, or the United States has natural resources that Egypt does not have, and now they no longer have access to that resource. And also in a world that is increasingly more interconnected. Let's look at Russia and Ukraine, for example. Russia invades Ukraine, and in response, all of these nations band together to cut off trade, sanction their economy, etc. That is commercial liberalism at work. Russia had an economic interdependence on those countries and vice versa, and by going to war with Ukraine, the cost was very high to them. And you see a lot of economic issues in Russia right now because of that cost of war being raised due to economic interdependence. And this leads, this is globalization, international trade. Commercial liberalism, it also states that there's a strategic interdependence, and because that strategic interdependence, peace is just easier. It is the path of least resistance. Also, liberalism, this is more just in general, not with specific regard to commercial liberalism, but liberalism is self-reinforcing. So commercial liberalism reinforces institutional liberalism, which reinforces Republican liberalism, which reinforces commercial liberalism, etc. And therefore, liberalism begets more liberalism. The more you do these things, the more that you globalize your trade, the more that you have free and fair elections, the system grows upon itself and becomes stronger, more liberal. Here we have realism versus liberalism. So realism on the left, liberalism on the right. Realism believes in sovereignty, military power, self-interest. They see the world as a zero-sum game, and they're very focused on human nature. Liberalism, they look at things through the lens of cooperation, diplomacy, democracy, institutions, and trade. These are sort of the 5 tenets that I could identify between the two. And one thing to note is going back a little bit, but sovereignty can be exchanged. I mean, obviously, we're not like a market system here, but sovereignty can be exchanged or given up for security, in a way. Like the NATO and the EU. Every member of NATO gives up some amount of their sovereignty in exchange for security. EU, same thing, but with trade. So there's kind of the differentiation, which is why sovereignty is on realism's side and on liberalism's side. And I think that's the end of my slideshow. Yes, I'm going to leave it here. I hope that on the off chance any of my professors saw this, that they think I did a pretty good job remembering this stuff. I did this off the top of my head for the most part, but I'd love to hear in the comments down below what you guys thought about this little presentation. Did you find any of this compelling or interesting? Did anything about this stand out to you? I'd love to hear it. Again, a little off the beaten track here. I don't know if anybody's gonna like this at all, but it's something I've wanted to do for a little while now, so I decided to just pull the trigger and do it. If you guys did like this video, please leave a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel for more content. Probably not like this every single day. Until next time, guys. Bye bye.